The first time someone told me to stay quiet in a meeting, I thought I had misheard. It was during a quarterly strategy session, the kind of room where big decisions were made and voices were supposed to matter. I had spent days preparing a market analysis, one that highlighted a risk no one else seemed to see. I raised my hand, waited my turn, and started laying it out. That's when my manager cut me off. "Maybe just stay quiet on this one," he said, smiling like he was doing me a favor. "Let the more senior folks handle it." The room chuckled politely, and just like that, I was dismissed. My research, my preparation, my perspective, all silenced with a single sentence. I remember staring at the glossy conference table, heat rising in my face, as my voice was swallowed up by the same men who dominated every meeting. They went back to debating ideas that I had already analyzed and disproven in my notes. But it didn't matter. I had been told my role: listen, nod, stay quiet. At first, I convinced myself it was a one-time thing, but it wasn't. Over the next few months, every time I spoke up, someone found a way to shut me down. Sometimes it was subtle. We'll circle back to that. Sometimes it was sharper. Let's keep this focused. The result was always the same. My ideas never made it to the table. It wasn't that I lacked the knowledge. In fact, I was often the one doing the grunt work that made the flashy presentations possible. But in a culture that rewarded loud confidence over quiet expertise, my voice didn't carry weight. The irony. Weeks later, I'd watch one of my male colleagues present the exact same point I had raised earlier, and suddenly it was brilliant. The CEO would nod thoughtfully, the VP would praise him for being innovative, and the whole room would act like they were witnessing a revelation. Meanwhile, I sat there, silent. Again. But here's the thing, you can only silence someone for so long before they start finding other ways to be heard. And while they thought they were keeping me in my place, they were really fueling a determination in me I didn't even know I had. Because years later, I wouldn't just be speaking up in meetings, I'd be standing on stages in front of hundreds, even thousands of people. The same voice they once told me to hide companies now pay tens of thousands of dollars for a single keynote. And the best part, some of those companies are the very same ones that once told me to stay quiet. But back then, sitting in that suffocating conference room, all I could feel was the sting of humiliation. And that sting was about to turn into the fuel for a fire I would never let die. The company I worked for prided itself on being progressive and forward-thinking, but behind the glossy mission statements and shiny diversity posters, the truth was harder to swallow. It was a boys' club, plain and simple. The senior leadership team was almost entirely male, most of them golf buddies who'd known each other for years. Promotions weren't about skill or innovation, they were about proximity. If you laughed at the boss's jokes, stayed late to have beers with the VP, or joined the weekend fishing trips, your career moved forward. If you didn't or couldn't, you stayed where you were, no matter how much value you brought to the table. I wasn't the only one who noticed, but I was one of the few who cared enough to push back. And that made me stand out in a way that wasn't safe. Meetings became an unspoken hierarchy. The loudest men dominated the room, tossing out half-baked ideas and slapping each other on the back for being bold thinkers. When women spoke, it was tolerated at best, ignored at worst. If a woman challenged the consensus, it was seen as emotional or combative. If a man did the same, he was fearless. I learned quickly that speaking up came with a price. My performance reviews suddenly included comments about being too intense or not collaborative enough, even though my work consistently delivered results. Meanwhile, colleagues who contributed far less were labeled rising stars just because they knew how to play the game. The favoritism ran deeper than meetings. One colleague, Tom, was known for recycling other people's work and presenting it as his own. Everyone saw it, but leadership never called him out. Instead, he kept climbing the ladder, Why? Because Tom played golf with the CEO every Friday. It didn't matter that he couldn't back up his flashy presentations with real data that was my job and I was invisible. And then there was the unspoken rule that women in the office were expected to be agreeable, supportive, and quiet. Anytime I pressed harder on an issue, I could see the discomfort on my boss's face, as if I had broken some invisible code. I wasn't stepping out of line professionally, I was stepping out of the role they had quietly assigned me, the note taker, the slide maker, the support. That culture of favoritism and silencing wasn't just frustrating, it was exhausting. I felt like I was screaming into a void, my voice bouncing off walls that had been built long before I ever walked into that office. Looking back, I realize now why the betrayal cut so deep when they told me to stay quiet. It wasn't just about that single moment in the meeting. It was the culmination of years of being undervalued, overlooked, and dismissed, not because I lacked ability, but because I didn't fit the mold of who they thought deserved to be heard. At the time, though, all I knew was that I couldn't keep shrinking myself to fit into a culture designed to keep me small. And the breaking point was closer than I realized. The breaking moment didn't come as a dramatic explosion. It came in the form of a boardroom full of executives, the smell of burnt coffee, and the sound of my own voice being erased in real time. We were in a high-stakes strategy meeting about a potential expansion deal. I had spent weeks crunching the numbers, preparing projections, and identifying risks no one else had considered. My research was airtight. I knew the data inside and out. When the discussion veered into territory I had studied extensively, I leaned forward and presented my analysis. I spoke clearly, calmly, and backed every point with evidence. For a few seconds the room went quiet. I thought just maybe this was the moment they'd finally see my value. Then it happened. The CEO, without even looking at me, waved his hand dismissively and said, "Let's not get into the weeds here. Stay quiet and let's hear from Tom." And just like that, my weeks of preparation, my credibility, and my voice were shoved off the table. Tom, the same colleague who had stolen slides from me before, parroted a watered-down version of my analysis 5 minutes later. The CEO nodded approvingly, praising him for his strategic insight. The board members leaned in as if he had just delivered a stroke of genius. I sat there, my pen frozen in my hand, heat rushing up my neck. I wasn't just ignored, I was silenced, told in front of the highest leaders of the company that my voice didn't matter, that my role was not to lead, but to stay quiet while someone else took credit for my work. Something broke inside me that day. It wasn't just humiliation, it was clarity. For years, I had convinced myself that if I just worked harder, spoke smarter, or proved myself one more time, I'd earn a seat at the table. But in that moment, I saw the truth. No amount of effort would change a system designed to keep me invisible. I left that meeting smiling, politely, nodding at Tom's so-called brilliance. But inside, I was done. The betrayal wasn't simply that they had silenced me. It was that I had allowed myself to hope they'd do otherwise. That hope died in that boardroom. That night, as I replayed the moment in my head, the decision crystallized. I wouldn't waste another ounce of energy fighting to be heard in a room that had already decided I didn't belong. If they didn't want my voice, fine, I would find my own stage one where people paid to listen. That was the point of no return. After that boardroom meeting, I stopped trying to win their approval. It wasn't worth the exhaustion of shouting into a void. Instead, I began to redirect my energy quietly, strategically toward something bigger. The first step was reclaiming my voice, not in the office, but outside of it. I started attending local professional meetups and industry networking events, the kinds of gatherings I used to skip because I thought real influence only came from climbing the corporate ladder. I introduced myself not as someone's employee, but as someone with ideas worth hearing. And for the first time, people actually listened. Then I tested the waters further. I began writing short LinkedIn posts breaking down the same data-driven insights that my company had dismissed. To my surprise, those posts gained traction. Strangers commented, messaged, and even asked me to elaborate on topics I thought no one cared about. The feedback was a revelation my ideas weren't the problem. The room I was in was the problem. I invested in myself in secret. On weekends, I signed up for a public speaking workshop, something I once would have avoided like the plague. Standing on a stage, even in a small classroom, felt terrifying at first. But each time I practiced, my voice grew steadier. The instructor pulled me aside one day and said, "You've got presence, you just need to own it." That sentence lit a fire in me. Meanwhile, at work, I played along. I kept my head down, delivered my projects, and nodded through meetings as if I'd accepted my place. But in reality, I was building a second career in the shadows. Every night, I poured hours into shaping content, crafting stories, and studying the art of communication, not just speaking, but captivating. My first real break came when a colleague from another company who had been following my LinkedIn posts asked if I'd speak on a panel for a regional industry event. The audience was only about 60 people, but I treated it like a TED Talk. I poured myself into preparation, not just delivering facts, but telling a story. When the panel ended, people lined up to shake my hand. Someone even said, "You should be doing this full time." That night, driving home, I knew I was onto something. From then on, my quiet preparation had a sharper edge. I built a personal brand around clarity, authenticity, and courage, the very things my company had tried to suppress. Each step, each event, each post was a brick in the foundation of the platform I was building. I didn't tell my coworkers, I didn't announce it. I simply let them keep thinking I was the quiet one while I was sharpening my voice somewhere they'd never bothered to look. The stage was being set. And when the moment came, they wouldn't just hear me, they'd pay for the privilege. The first time I stood on a stage in front of 1,000 people, I thought back to those fluorescent-lit conference rooms where my voice was clipped short and dismissed. The irony was almost too perfect. I had once been told to stay quiet, and now I was being handed a microphone. By then, I had built momentum. My posts had turned into articles, my small panels had grown into keynote invitations, and my nights of practice had transformed me from hesitant to commanding. I no longer wondered whether people would listen. I knew they would because I had earned it. That keynote was for a national industry conference, the kind of event where executives, investors, and decision-makers filled the seats. I had rehearsed my talk for weeks, not just the words, but the pauses, the eye contact, the way I would walk the stage to pull people in. When the lights dimmed and I stepped forward, I could feel the silence in the room waiting for me to speak. And I spoke, not timidly, not apologetically, but with the authority of someone who had lived the data, breathed the solutions, and finally found the stage she deserved. My voice carried through the auditorium, not just sharing information, but weaving a story about vision resilience and the cost of silencing innovation. The audience was captivated. They laughed when I wanted them to laugh, leaned forward when I dropped a revelation, and erupted in applause at the end. I wasn't just delivering a talk. I was commanding the room in a way my old boss never thought I could. And then I saw them. A cluster of familiar faces in the audience, executives from my old company. The very ones who used to cut me off mid-sentence, who rolled their eyes at my ideas, who once told me directly that my strength was knowing when to stay quiet. Now they were sitting in the crowd, listening silently, notebooks open, jotting down the same kind of insights they used to dismiss. The reversal was almost cinematic. Afterward, I stepped off stage to a line of people waiting to talk to me. Among them, awkwardly, were 2 managers from my former team. They congratulated me stiffly, their smiles tight, and one even admitted, "We should have listened to you back then." I just smiled because the truth was I no longer needed their validation. Their acknowledgement came too late, and I'd already outgrown the room they tried to keep me in. That night, I checked my email and saw multiple paid speaking requests waiting in my inbox. Companies wanted me to do for their teams what my own company had never allowed: inspire, educate, and empower. The tables had turned. I was no longer the woman told to stay quiet. I was the woman they now had to pay to hear. In the months that followed, my calendar filled with more speaking requests than I could have imagined. Conferences, leadership retreats, even Fortune 500 companies' organizations were flying me across the country to do the very thing I'd once been told I wasn't capable of: use my voice. The money was good, better than any paycheck I'd earned in my corporate years, but the real reward wasn't financial. It was standing on stages and watching people take notes, nod along, and leave the room energized. I wasn't just speaking. I was sparking change in places that desperately needed it. And each time I stepped up to the podium, I carried the memory of those meetings where my words were clipped short. It wasn't bitterness anymore. It was fuel. As for my old company, I heard through the grapevine that turnover was high and morale was sinking. They had built a culture on silencing voices like mine, and eventually it caught up with them. People don't stay where they're ignored. Innovation doesn't thrive where dissent is punished. They tried to keep control by shutting people out, but all they did was create cracks too wide to repair. But here's the truth. I didn't build my new life to spite them. Revenge might have been the spark, but it wasn't the fire. The real victory was reclaiming my confidence, my purpose, and my ability to shape my own story. I used to think success meant climbing the ladder, earning titles, and getting approval from people in power. But standing on those stages taught me something different. Success is finding the courage to speak even when someone tells you to stay quiet. Especially then. Now, when I look out at an audience, I see women and men who remind me of who I once was: hesitant, underestimated, waiting for permission to speak. And I tell them what I wish someone had told me years ago: your voice matters. Don't hand it over to people who can't hear its value. Sometimes late at night, I think back to that moment in the boardroom when my boss leaned over and said, "Stay quiet. It's not your place." If I could go back, I wouldn't argue or try to prove him wrong. I'd just smile, because I know now his words weren't the end of my story. They were the beginning, and that to me is the sweetest victory of all.